I was folding towels in my laundry room Tuesday afternoon when I heard the front door open with a slam that rattled the glass in the china cabinet. This wasn't his usual careful click of the lock, or even his hurried rush when he was late for something. This was the sound of someone who had made a decision and wasn't planning to ask permission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The voices that followed confirmed my suspicion. Marcus's deep baritone mixing with a higher, unfamiliar feminine laugh that echoed through the hallway and into the kitchen. I set down the towel I'd been folding and walked toward the front of the house, my slippers silent on the hardwood floors I'd polished just that morning. What I found in my living room stopped me cold. Marcus stood near my favorite armchair, the one I'd inherited from my mother 40 years ago, with his arm around a young woman I'd never seen before. She couldn't have been more than 25, with platinum blonde hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through my bay windows and clothes that suggested she'd never folded a towel in her life. But what made my chest tighten wasn't her appearance. It was the 3 large suitcases stacked near my coffee table, and the way Marcus was looking at me with that expression I remembered from his teenage years, the one that meant he'd already decided something and was daring me to object. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he used when he knew he was about to ask for something unreasonable. "I'd like you to meet Jasmine. Jasmine, this is my mother, Eleanor." Jasmine stepped forward with a smile that was probably meant to be charming, but struck me as practiced, the kind of smile someone uses when they're trying to sell you something you don't need. "Mrs. Patterson, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Marcus has told me so much about you." I looked at Marcus, then at Jasmine, then at those suitcases, and felt something settle in my stomach like a stone. "How nice," I said, keeping my voice level. "Are you visiting from out of town?" The pause that followed lasted just long enough for me to know that whatever came next was going to change everything about my quiet Tuesday afternoon. "Actually," Marcus said, running his hand through his hair the way he'd done since he was 5 years old, "Jasmine's going to be staying with us for a while. Her lease ended and she needed somewhere to land while she looks for a new place." The casual way he said us hit me like a slap. In the 43 years since I'd brought Marcus home from the hospital, he'd never once used us to refer to himself and another woman in my house. Even during his brief marriage to Sarah, they'd lived in their own apartment across town. "Staying with us," I repeated, my teacher's instincts kicking in, the tone I'd used for 35 years when a student tried to turn in homework they clearly hadn't done themselves. "Just temporarily," Jasmine interjected, her voice bright and confident. "I'm looking at apartments all over the city. I just need a few weeks to find the right place." She gestured around my living room with an appraising look that made me want to count my grandmother's silver. "This is such a beautiful home. You've created such a warm, welcoming space." I'd been teaching long enough to recognize manipulation when I heard it, and Jasmine's compliments felt as genuine as a $3 bill. But what bothered me more was the way Marcus was nodding along, as if this had all been discussed and decided without any input from the person who actually owned the house. "Marcus," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "could I speak with you in the kitchen for a moment?" "Sure, Mom." He kissed Jasmine's cheek, a gesture so casual it suggested this wasn't their first day together, and followed me past the dining room where my good china sat behind glass doors that suddenly felt very vulnerable. In the kitchen, I turned to face my son, this man I'd raised from a helpless infant, and tried to find some trace of the boy who used to ask permission before taking a cookie from the jar. "When were you planning to mention this arrangement to me?" I asked. Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he used to do when caught in a lie about homework. "I know it seems sudden, but Jasmine really needed help, and you've always taught me to help people when they're in trouble." Using my own words against me. Another skill he'd learned in childhood and apparently never outgrown. "Help is bringing someone dinner when they're sick, Marcus. Help is not moving a stranger into your mother's house without asking." "She's not a stranger to me," he said, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. There was a defensiveness there, but also something that looked like embarrassment. "We've been seeing each other for 6 months. 6 months, and this was the first I'd heard of her." That stung more than I wanted to admit. Marcus and I had always been close, especially after his father died 8 years ago. We had dinner together most Sundays, talked on the phone twice a week, shared the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd been through everything together. The idea that he'd been in a serious relationship for half a year without mentioning it felt like a betrayal all by itself. 6 months, I said. And you never thought to introduce us until you needed something. It wasn't like that. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and I knew it was exactly like that. From the living room came the sound of Jasmine's laughter, bright and performative, followed by what sounded like her moving furniture. My furniture? How long exactly is a few weeks? I asked. Marcus shrugged, a gesture that took me back to every argument we'd ever had about responsibility and consequences. However long it takes her to find a place. The rental market is crazy right now. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at my backyard, where I'd spent the morning weeding the flower bed. Harold had helped me plant the year before he died. Everything in that garden had been chosen carefully, planned, nurtured. Nothing had been allowed to take root without permission. Marcus, I said, without turning around, I need you to understand something. This is my home. I've worked for 40 years to make it exactly what I want it to be. I choose who lives here. I know, Mom, but nothing. I turned back to face him. You're 35 years old. If you want to live with your girlfriend, you get your own place. You don't volunteer your mother's house as a charity case. The hurt that crossed his face was genuine, and for a moment I almost softened. Almost. Then I heard Jasmine's voice from the living room, talking on what sounded like a phone call, making herself comfortable in my space as if she'd been invited. She doesn't have anywhere else to go, Marcus said quietly. That's not my problem. When did you become so heartless? The accusation hit harder than I expected. I'd spent my entire adult life helping people. 35 years of teaching had been nothing but helping other people's children learn and grow. I'd volunteered at the food bank, served on church committees, been the person neighbors called when they needed a favor. But somewhere in all that helping, I'd apparently failed to teach my own son the difference between charity and being taken advantage of. I'm not heartless, I said. I'm protective of my home and my peace of mind. There's a difference. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Finally he sighed. Just give her a chance, Mom. 1 week. If you don't like having her here after 1 week, I'll help her find somewhere else to stay. 1 week. It seemed reasonable on the surface, the kind of compromise I might have made in a classroom dispute. But something about the way Marcus said it, too quick and too confident, made me suspect he was counting on something changing in that week. Counting on me getting attached, or worn down, or simply giving up the fight. 1 week, I said. And she pays for groceries and utilities while she's here. Of course, and she cleans up after herself. Absolutely. And Marcus? I waited until he met my eyes. This never happens again. Next time you want to make decisions about who lives in my house, you ask first. He nodded, but I could see the relief in his expression, the satisfaction of someone who'd gotten what he wanted, and was already planning how to extend the arrangement. We walked back to the living room together, where I found Jasmine sitting in Harold's old recliner, the one I'd kept exactly as he'd left it, with his reading glasses still tucked into the side pocket, and his bookmark still marking his place in the mystery novel he'd never finished. She was scrolling through her phone with her feet up on the footrest, completely at ease in a chair that had been sacred space in my house for 8 years. Something cold settled in my chest as I watched her. Something that felt like the moment you realize you've left your front door unlocked in a bad neighborhood. Everything settled, she asked brightly, looking up from her phone with that same practiced smile. For now, I said. Marcus tells me you'll be staying for 1 week while you look for an apartment. If she heard the emphasis I put on 1 week, she didn't show it. Instead, she bounced up from Harold's chair with enthusiasm that felt excessive. That's so generous of you, Mrs. Patterson. I promise I won't be any trouble at all. People who promise they won't be trouble, I'd learned over the years, usually are. I was just thinking, she continued. That spare bedroom upstairs would be perfect. It gets such lovely morning light. My spare bedroom, the room where I kept Harold's things, his clothes still hanging in the closet, his books still stacked on the nightstand, his cologne still sitting on the dresser, where he'd left it the morning he'd had his heart attack. I'd been slowly working up the courage to sort through his belongings, but I wasn't ready to have someone else sleeping in his space. Actually, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, that room isn't available, you can have the couch. The look that passed between Marcus and Jasmine lasted only a second, but it was enough. This wasn't the plan they'd discussed. This wasn't what they'd expected. The couch, Jasmine's smile flickered. For a whole week. It's very comfortable, I said. I've napped on it many times. But my things, she gestured toward the suitcases, as if the amount of luggage she'd brought gave her some claim to better accommodations. Can stay in the hall closet. Another look between them, this one longer and more pointed. I was beginning to understand that Marcus and Jasmine had their own language, their own way of communicating that didn't include words. It made me feel like an outsider in my own home. That's fine, Marcus said quickly, before Jasmine could argue further. The couch is great, right, Jazz? Jazz, a nickname that suggested intimacy, history, the kind of easy familiarity that develops over months of private conversations and shared secrets. It made me wonder what else I didn't know about my son's relationship, what other surprises might be waiting in those 3 suitcases. Of course, Jasmine agreed, but her smile had tightened around the edges. I'm just grateful to have somewhere safe to stay. Safe, another word that carried implications, suggested dangers I hadn't considered. What was she running from? Who was she hiding from? And why had my son volunteered my house as a refuge without telling me what we might be sheltering her from? Well then, I said, clapping my hands together the way I used to do when ending a lesson, I suppose we should get you settled. Dinner is at 6. I hope you like meatloaf. I'm actually vegetarian, Jasmine said. Of course she was. The first 3 days passed in a blur of small irritations that accumulated like dust in corners. Jasmine was the kind of house guest who treated someone else's home like a hotel, leaving coffee cups on tables without coasters, using towels once before dropping them on bathroom floors, and playing music through her phone speakers at volumes that suggested she'd forgotten other people lived in the house. But it was the small intimacies that bothered me most. The way she helped herself to food from my refrigerator without asking. The way she rearranged the throw pillows on my couch every morning after sleeping on it, creating a different aesthetic in my living room that felt foreign and unwelcome. The way she used my shower like it was her own, leaving bottles of expensive shampoo on the rim of my bathtub, and using all the hot water so that when I went to shower in the evenings, I was left with lukewarm spray that made me think longingly of my former solitude. What disturbed me more than her presumption, though, was Marcus's behavior. He'd always been considerate, the kind of son who called before visiting and brought flowers when invited to dinner. But with Jasmine in the house, he'd transformed into someone I barely recognized. He came by every evening after work, but instead of spending time with me, he disappeared into the living room where he and Jasmine would whisper and laugh, and make plans that clearly didn't include his mother. They ordered takeout without asking what I wanted. They watched television programs I'd never chosen, turning my living room into their private entertainment center. They spoke in shorthand and inside jokes that made me feel like a stranger in my own home. On Thursday morning, I woke up to find Jasmine in my kitchen at 5:30, talking on her phone in a voice too low for me to make out words, but with an urgency that suggested whatever conversation she was having wasn't casual. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and greeted me with that same bright smile that was starting to feel more like a mask than a genuine expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I hope I didn't wake you." "Early call," I observed, moving toward the coffee maker that had become my first destination every morning for 23 years. "Oh, you know how it is. Different time zones and all that." I didn't know, actually. I didn't know who she'd been talking to, or why they were calling before dawn, or what time zones had to do with apartment hunting in our city. But I filed the information away with all the other small details that didn't quite add up about my unexpected house guest. "Any luck with the apartment search?" I asked, measuring coffee with the precision I'd learned over decades of early morning routines. "I'm seeing a few places this weekend," she said, but something in her voice suggested she was reading from a script rather than reporting genuine progress. The market is just so competitive right now. I'm sure something will turn up soon. I hope so. I know you're eager to have your space back. There was something in the way she said it, a subtle acknowledgement that she understood exactly how unwelcome she was, that made me look at her more carefully. For just a moment, the bright mask slipped, and I saw something that looked like calculation in her eyes, the expression of someone who was playing a longer game than anyone realized. Then Marcus's key turned in the lock, and Jasmine's face immediately brightened into its usual performance of enthusiasm. "Morning, baby," she called, moving toward the front door, with the kind of easy familiarity that suggested she'd been greeting him this way for much longer than 6 months. Baby, another intimacy that felt too big for my kitchen, too presumptuous for my house. I poured my coffee and retreated to the dining room, where I could watch them through the doorway without being part of their reunion. They embraced like people who'd been separated for weeks rather than hours, and their whispered conversation had the kind of intensity that suggested they were making plans, or sharing secrets, or both. When Marcus finally joined me for coffee, as had been our tradition since he was 16, he seemed distracted, checking his phone every few minutes and glancing toward the living room where Jasmine had settled in with her laptop. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Fine," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just work stuff. And Jasmine, how's her job search going?" Another pause, the kind that suggested I'd asked a more complicated question than intended. "She's freelancing right now, web design stuff. Very flexible schedule." Freelancing, another vague explanation that could mean anything or nothing. I'd noticed that every question I asked about Jasmine's life seemed to generate answers that created more questions than they resolved. "That must be nice," I said, "working from home." "Yeah, she can work anywhere with internet." Marcus took a sip of coffee and winced, as if it had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention. "Actually, Mom, I was thinking maybe Jasmine could use the spare bedroom after all, just for a few more days, until she finds a place. The couch isn't really comfortable for long-term sleeping."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Long-term, the phrase sent a chill through me. We were only 4 days into what was supposed to be a 1-week arrangement, and already Marcus was talking about extending it and upgrading her accommodations. "The spare bedroom isn't available," I said firmly. "It's just sitting empty." "It's not empty to me." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have warned him away. Instead, he finished his coffee in silence and left for work with a kiss on Jasmine's cheek that lasted longer than necessary, and felt like a performance for my benefit. After they were both gone, I walked through my house slowly, taking inventory of changes I hadn't noticed before. Jasmine's phone charger plugged into an outlet in my hallway, her magazines stacked on my coffee table, her coffee cup in my sink, unwashed from yesterday morning. Small intrusions that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested someone who was settling in for more than a temporary stay. I was examining her magazines, trying to understand what kind of person read publications devoted entirely to celebrity gossip and expensive fashion, when the phone rang. "Eleanor?" The voice was familiar, though I hadn't heard it in months. "This is Patricia Hendricks, from Marcus's office." Patricia was Marcus's supervisor at the accounting firm where he'd worked for 8 years. I'd met her at company Christmas parties and retirement celebrations. A brisk woman in her 50s who'd always seemed fond of Marcus and appreciative of his work. "Patricia, how nice to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "Well, that's what I was calling to ask you. Marcus hasn't been in the office for 2 weeks, and we haven't been able to reach him. His phone goes straight to voicemail, and the emergency contact number we have for him is yours." 2 weeks. Marcus had been coming to my house every evening for the past 4 days, always claiming he was stopping by after work. If he hadn't been to work in 2 weeks, where had he been spending his days? "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "He mentioned he might be taking some time off. Not according to our records. As far as we know, he just stopped showing up. We've been trying to be patient because he's always been such a reliable employee. But Eleanor, if he doesn't contact us soon, We're going to have to assume he's abandoned his position. After Patricia hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone for a long time. Marcus had lied to me. For 2 weeks, he'd been pretending to go to work, pretending to have a normal routine, while actually doing something else entirely, something he couldn't tell me about. Something that had started around the same time Jasmine had supposedly needed a place to stay. I looked around my kitchen, this room where I'd fed Marcus breakfast every school day for 12 years, where I'd helped him with homework and listened to his problems and celebrated his achievements. The same kitchen where 4 days ago he'd lied to me about why his girlfriend needed to move into my house. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt genuinely afraid, not of Jasmine, not even of Marcus, but of how little I apparently knew about either of them. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to my volunteer shift at the library and spent 3 hours cleaning out my bedroom closet instead, going through boxes of old papers and photographs with the methodical thoroughness I'd once applied to grading essays. I was looking for something, though I couldn't have said what exactly. Evidence maybe. Proof that the son I'd raised was still the person I thought he was. Reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind or my ability to judge character. What I found instead, tucked into a box of Christmas decorations I hadn't opened in 2 years, was a bundle of letters Marcus had written to me during his first year of college. I'd saved them because they were so full of gratitude and love, evidence of the close relationship we'd maintained even after he'd left home. Reading them now, I was struck by how different his voice sounded in writing than it did in person. On paper he was thoughtful, articulate, honest about his struggles and appreciative of my support. The person who'd written these letters would never have moved a stranger into my house without asking, would never have lied about going to work. I was still reading when Jasmine came home, her key turning in my lock with the confidence of someone who'd been given permission rather than someone who was imposing. She found me in the living room with the letters spread across my coffee table, and for a moment her bright smile faltered. "Old correspondence?" she asked, settling onto the couch with the easy familiarity that had bothered me from day one. "Letters from Marcus in college. Sweet. He's always been close to his family." She picked up one of the letters, scanning it with the kind of casual interest that suggested she thought she had a right to read my personal papers. "He talks about you all the time, does he?" "Oh yes, you're very important to him." She set the letter back down with elaborate care. "That's why I was so excited to meet you, and why I hope we can be friends." Friends. The word sounded wrong coming from her, too presumptuous and too calculated. Friends was something that developed over time through shared experiences and mutual trust. You didn't become friends with someone by moving into their house uninvited and rearranging their furniture. "That would be nice," I said, because it seemed like the expected response. "I know this whole situation is a little unconventional. Most people would have just said no." When Marcus asked if I could stay here, Jasmine leaned forward, her expression suddenly serious. "The fact that you said yes tells me you're someone who understands that sometimes people need help, even when it's not convenient." There was something about the way she said it, a subtle emphasis on certain words, that made me feel like I was being tested. Like she was gauging my response to see how much I suspected, how much I was willing to tolerate. "Everyone needs help sometimes," I said carefully. "Exactly. And I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for the roof over my head, but for not asking a lot of uncomfortable questions." Uncomfortable questions. The phrase hung in the air between us like a warning. Don't dig too deep. Don't ask what you're not supposed to know. Accept the surface story and don't look underneath. "I try to respect people's privacy," I said. "That's so rare these days. Most people want to know everything about everyone else's business." Jasmine stood up with a bright smile that felt more like a dismissal than a continuation of our conversation. "I think I'll take a shower before Marcus gets home. Thanks for the chat, Eleanor." Eleanor. Not Mrs. Patterson anymore, but my first name, spoken with the casual familiarity of someone who considered us equals rather than house guest and homeowner. After she disappeared upstairs, I gathered Marcus's letters back into their bundle and returned them to the Christmas box. But one sentence from our conversation kept echoing in my mind, not asking a lot of uncomfortable questions. The thing was, I hadn't asked many questions at all. I'd accepted Marcus's explanation about Jasmine's housing situation, accepted her vague answers about her work and her apartment search, accepted the whole arrangement with the kind of passive politeness I'd been taught was proper behavior for someone my generation. But maybe politeness wasn't what this situation called for. Maybe what it called for was exactly the kind of uncomfortable questions Jasmine seemed so grateful I wasn't asking. That evening, when Marcus arrived with Chinese takeout, and that same distracted expression he'd been wearing all week, I decided to start asking them. "How was work today?" I asked, as casually as I could manage. The pause before he answered lasted just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "Busy. End of the month crunch. You know how it is." Patricia Hendricks called today. The container of lo mein slipped from Marcus's hand, hitting the kitchen counter with a soft thud that seemed abnormally loud in the sudden silence. "She did. She was concerned because you haven't been to work in 2 weeks." Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally resignation. It was like watching someone realize they'd been caught in a lie and trying to decide whether to confess or construct a bigger lie to cover the first one. "I can explain," he said finally. "I'm sure you can. The question is whether you're going to explain it truthfully this time." From the living room came the sound of Jasmine's laughter, bright and performative, as always, though I couldn't hear whatever she was responding to. The television was on, playing some mindless comedy that served as background noise to whatever conversation Marcus and I were about to have. "I took some time off," Marcus said. "Personal leave. Without telling your supervisor." It was complicated. Most lies are. The word lies hung between us like an accusation, which I suppose it was. Marcus stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked like he was trying to decide whether I was still the mother he could manipulate with charm and selective honesty, or someone more dangerous. "I'm not lying, Mom. I just can't explain everything right now." Can't or won't, both. At least that was honest. But it was the kind of honesty that created more problems than it solved, the kind that suggested whatever Marcus was hiding was bigger than I'd imagined. "Does this have something to do with Jasmine?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Why would you think that?" "Because you've been together for 6 months but never mentioned her until you needed my house for her to stay in. Because she moved in with 3 suitcases like someone who's running from something rather than someone whose lease just ended. Because you stopped going to work around the same time she started needing a place to hide." The word slipped out before I'd consciously decided to use it, but as soon as I said it, I knew it was the right word. Jasmine wasn't just staying at my house, she was hiding at my house. The question was what she was hiding from. "You don't understand," Marcus said. "Then help me understand." But before he could answer, Jasmine appeared in the kitchen doorway, her timing so perfect it seemed choreographed. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, though her bright smile suggested she already knew it wasn't. "Fine," Marcus said quickly. "Just talking." Looked pretty intense, from where I was sitting. Jasmine moved to Marcus's side with the fluid grace of someone who'd perfected the art of positioning herself exactly where she needed to be. "Maybe I should give you two some privacy." "That's not necessary," I said. "I was just asking Marcus about work." "Oh," Jasmine's smile flickered, the same tiny hesitation I'd noticed before when she was calculating her response. "How nice that you take such an interest in his career." The comment was delivered with perfect sweetness, but underneath it was a clear message: you're being intrusive, asking questions that aren't your business, crossing boundaries you shouldn't cross. "I've always been interested in Marcus's life," I said. "All aspects of it." "Of course, that's what mothers do." Another sweet smile, another subtle warning. Though sometimes it's hard to know when caring becomes worrying, isn't it? I looked at this woman who'd been living in my house for 4 days, using my shower and eating my food and sleeping on my couch, and realized she was giving me advice about how to be a mother to my own son. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "I'll worry about that," I said. Naturally, Jasmine turned to Marcus with an expression that managed to be both loving and possessive. "Baby, why don't you help me bring in my things from the car? I picked up a few groceries today." More things, more evidence of someone planning to stay longer than a week. I watched them walk outside together, their heads bent close in conversation that clearly didn't include me, and felt something shift in my chest like a locked door finally opening. I'd spent 4 days being polite, being accommodating, being the kind of hostess I'd been raised to be. I'd accepted explanations that didn't make sense, tolerated behavior that made me uncomfortable, and allowed 2 people to take over my home with barely a word of protest. But politeness, I was beginning to realize, was a luxury I could no longer afford. Not when my son was lying to me about work. Not when his girlfriend was hiding something that required my house as a refuge. Not when both of them were treating my questions like intrusions and my concerns like inconveniences. When they came back inside carrying grocery bags and speaking in whispers, I was waiting in the living room with a decision I'd made while they were outside. "Jasmine," I said, "I'd like to know exactly what you're running from." The grocery bag in her hand dropped to the floor with a soft thud, and for the first time since I'd met her, her smile disappeared completely. The silence that followed my question stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Jasmine stood frozen in my living room, the dropped grocery bag at her feet, her face completely transformed from its usual mask of bright cheerfulness into something raw and unguarded. For the first time since she'd walked into my house, I was seeing her actual expression rather than the performance she'd been giving me for 4 days. Marcus stepped between us, his body language protective in a way that confirmed my suspicions about whatever Jasmine was hiding. "Mom, you don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. Some things are better left alone." I'd heard that phrase before, from students who'd been caught cheating, from neighbors who didn't want to discuss their family problems, from my own husband when he'd been diagnosed with heart disease and hadn't wanted to worry me with details. In my experience, when someone told you something was better left alone, that was exactly when you needed to dig deeper. "Not in my house," I said. "Not when I'm being asked to shelter someone without knowing what I'm sheltering them from." Jasmine finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and shakier than the confident tone she'd been using all week. "It's not what you think. I don't know what to think. That's the problem." She looked at Marcus with an expression that seemed to be asking permission for something. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, which told me they'd discussed this conversation before, had planned what they would and wouldn't reveal if I started asking direct questions. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Everything seems to be complicated when you two are involved." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture I remembered from every difficult conversation we'd ever had. "Look, Mom, some people got the wrong idea about Jasmine's business dealings. She just needs to lay low until things cool down." Business dealings, another vague phrase that could mean anything. But the fact that someone needed to lay low suggested those dealings hadn't been entirely legal. What kind of business? Another look between them, another silent conversation that excluded me completely. I was getting tired of being treated like an outsider in discussions about who was living in my house and why. "Online marketing," Jasmine said, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing again. "I help people build their social media presence, increase their follower counts, that sort of thing, and someone objects to that. Some competitors play dirty. They've been spreading rumors, trying to damage my reputation." She bent to pick up the dropped grocery bag, using the movement to avoid meeting my eyes. "I just need time for the situation to resolve itself." It sounded plausible on the surface, the kind of modern business dispute I didn't understand well enough to question effectively. But something about her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror, until she could deliver it convincingly. "What kind of rumors? Does it matter?" Marcus interjected. "The point is, she's not safe at her own place right now. Not safe. That was different from needing time for a business dispute to resolve. That suggested immediate physical danger, the kind that required hiding rather than just waiting. Not safe from competitors. Or not safe from someone else." The grocery bag crinkled in Jasmine's hands as her grip tightened. "I really don't want to drag you into this, Eleanor. The less you know, the better." There it was again, that suggestion that knowledge was dangerous, that asking questions would somehow put me at risk. But I'd lived 71 years without anyone needing to protect me from information, and I wasn't about to start now. "I'm already dragged into it," I said. "You're living in my house. Just temporarily. So you keep saying. but temporary has a way of becoming permanent when people don't want to face whatever they're running from. Jasmine's mask of cheerfulness had completely disappeared now, replaced by something that looked like desperation mixed with calculation. She was weighing her options, trying to decide how much truth she could afford to tell without losing her refuge. "There's a man," she said finally, "someone I used to work with. He's been threatening me." Now we were getting somewhere. I settled back in my chair with the patience I'd learned from decades of dealing with students who were finally ready to admit they'd done something wrong. "Threatening you how?" "Phone calls, emails. He showed up at my apartment a few times." Her voice gained momentum as she warmed to her story. "He thinks I owe him money from a project we worked on together. But he's wrong. He's just angry that I ended our partnership." "Did you call the police?" "It's complicated." That phrase again. I was beginning to understand that "it's complicated" was code for I can't involve the authorities because I wasn't entirely innocent either. "Complicated how?" Marcus stepped in before Jasmine could answer. "Mom, does it really matter? Someone is threatening her. She needs a safe place to stay." End of story. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning, and the fact that Marcus was so eager to shut down my questions told me there were chapters I hadn't heard yet. If someone is threatening her, she should file a restraining order. "It's not that simple," Jasmine said. "Why not?" Another pause. Another look between them. I was getting tired of these silent conferences that happened in front of me but without me. "Because the project we worked on together wasn't exactly legal," she said finally. There it was. The truth I'd been circling around for 4 days. Jasmine wasn't just a woman with housing problems. She was a woman with legal problems. And my son had volunteered my house as a hideout without bothering to mention that detail. What kind of not exactly legal? Just some gray area stuff. Internet marketing can be tricky. Sometimes the rules aren't clear. I'd taught 8th grade long enough to recognize when someone was trying to minimize their wrongdoing with careful word choice. Gray area stuff meant illegal. Rules aren't clear meant she'd known exactly what she was doing and had done it anyway. "Be specific." "Mom," Marcus warned, his voice taking on that tone he'd used as a teenager when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Don't mom me. I have a right to know what kind of situation I'm being asked to hide someone from." Jasmine sank onto my couch with the defeated posture of someone who'd run out of half-truths. "We were running fake social media accounts, building artificial followings for clients who wanted to look more popular than they actually were, selling engagement to influencers who needed their numbers to look impressive to sponsors. Fraud." She was describing fraud, though she was being careful not to use that word. "Creating false information to help people deceive others for financial gain. And your former partner wanted a bigger cut of the profits than we'd agreed on. When I said no, he started threatening to expose the whole operation unless I paid him what he was asking for. Blackmail. I prefer to think of it as aggressive negotiation. Despite everything, I almost smiled at that. Even when confessing to criminal activity, Jasmine was still trying to put a positive spin on the situation. "So you're hiding from someone who's trying to blackmail you over a fraud scheme you were running together." That's a very harsh way to put it, but accurate. She didn't argue with that, which was as close to a confession as I was likely to get. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "A couple of years. It started small, just helping friends boost their Instagram numbers. Then it grew into a real business. A real illegal business. Illegal is such a strong word. We were just providing a service people wanted." I looked at Marcus, who'd been unusually quiet during this conversation. "And you knew about this?" His silence lasted long enough to confirm what I already suspected. Not only had he known, he'd been involved somehow. "Marcus, I helped with some of the technical stuff," he admitted. "Website design, database management. Nothing major, nothing major, nothing major." My son, who'd been raised to value honesty and hard work, had been participating in an online fraud scheme and describing it as nothing major. "Is that why you stopped going to work?" Another pause. The business was taking off. We needed someone to manage it full-time. Full-time fraud. My son had quit his legitimate job to become a full-time criminal. The magnitude of it left me momentarily speechless. "When were you planning to mention this to me?" "We weren't," Jasmine said. "This was supposed to be temporary, just until I could figure out how to deal with Derek." "Derek?" the first real piece of information I'd gotten all week. A name to go with the threats and the blackmail. Derek is the former partner. Unfortunately, I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything I'd learned in the past 10 minutes. My son had quit his job to become a criminal. His girlfriend was a fraud artist being blackmailed by her former partner in crime, and they'd both decided that my house was the perfect place to hide from the consequences of their choices. I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. This conversation isn't over. I walked out to my back porch, where Harold and I used to sit together in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the maple trees he'd planted the year Marcus started kindergarten. The familiar view should have been comforting, but nothing felt familiar anymore. My whole world had shifted in the space of one conversation, and I wasn't sure how to find my balance again. Through the sliding glass door, I could see Marcus and Jasmine in heated discussion, their voices too low for me to make out words, but their body language suggesting disagreement, probably about how much to tell me, or whether to tell me anything more at all. I'd always prided myself on being a good judge of character. 35 years of teaching had honed my ability to spot troublemakers, liars, and kids who were heading for problems. But somehow I'd missed the signs that my own son was involved in criminal activity. Either my instincts were failing me, or Marcus had become much better at deception than I'd ever imagined. The back door slid open, and Marcus joined me on the porch. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by stress and secrets. "I know you're angry," he said. "Angry doesn't begin to cover it. I wanted to tell you, but I knew how you'd react. How I'd react to learning my son is a criminal. You thought I might disapprove." He flinched at the word criminal, which told me he'd been avoiding thinking of himself in those terms. "It's not as bad as it sounds. It sounds like fraud, blackmail, and hiding from the law. How much worse could it be?" Marcus leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the same view I'd been contemplating. "We helped people achieve their dreams. Do you know how hard it is for small businesses to build a social media following? How much legitimate influencers struggle to get noticed? We were leveling the playing field. By lying, by giving people the boost they needed to succeed." I'd heard similar rationalizations from students who'd cheated on tests, explanations that tried to reframe dishonesty as a necessary response to unfair circumstances. It never worked then, and it wasn't working now. And Derek got greedy. We had a good thing going, but he wanted to expand faster than was safe. When Jasmine said no, he got angry enough to threaten her. At first it was just business threats. He was going to start his own operation, take our clients, that kind of thing. But then it got personal. Personal how? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with how much to reveal. Finally he sighed. "He's been following her, showing up at places she goes, making it clear that he knows her schedule, her habits. Last week he sent her photos of her apartment building, her car, places she'd been. The message was pretty clear. Physical stalking to accompany the financial threats. That was serious. The kind of escalation that could turn dangerous quickly. Did she report it? Report what? That her former partner in an illegal business was threatening to expose their criminal activity unless she paid him money she didn't owe him. How do you think that conversation with the police would go? He had a point. Jasmine had put herself in a position where she couldn't seek help from legitimate authorities, because doing so would require admitting to crimes she'd committed. It was the kind of trap that kept people stuck in dangerous situations. "So your solution was to involve me." I thought if she could just disappear for a while, Derek would lose interest and move on to something else. And if he doesn't, then we'll figure something else out. Not she'll figure something out, or I'll help her figure something out, but we'll figure something out. My son was planning a future that included him and Jasmine, and whatever consequences came from their criminal activities. "Marcus, you need to walk away from this." "I can't do that." "Why not?" He turned to look at me directly, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not just love for Jasmine, but a kind of desperate attachment that looked more like addiction than affection. "Because I love her." Love doesn't require you to become a criminal. It does if the person you love is in danger because of something you helped create. That stopped me cold. "You helped create this situation with Derek." Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. Derek was my idea. I introduced him to Jasmine. The full picture was starting to come into focus, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus hadn't just gotten involved in Jasmine's criminal enterprise. He'd helped expand it by bringing in a partner who'd turned dangerous. He felt responsible for the threats she was facing because, in a very real sense, he was responsible. When, about 6 months ago, he had connections we needed, experience with the kind of large-scale operations we wanted to move into. Marcus rubbed his forehead like he was trying to massage away a headache. I thought I was helping her business grow. I never imagined he'd turn out to be such a problem. But he did. Yeah, he did. We stood in silence for a while, watching the evening light fade behind Harold's maple trees. I thought about all the conversations Harold and I had had on this porch about Marcus's future, his career plans, his eventual family. None of those conversations had included the possibility that our son would end up hiding criminals in our house. What happens now? I asked finally. I don't know. It was the first completely honest answer he'd given me in days, and somehow that made it the most frightening. How much money does Derek want? $50,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than I'd ever had in savings at one time. It was more than Harold had made in his best year at the post office. It was the kind of money that represented a lifetime of careful budgeting and modest dreams. Do you have $50,000? Not anymore. What happened to it? We invested everything back into the business. Equipment, software, advertising to attract new clients. Derek knew that when he made his demands, he knew we'd spent everything we'd made, so he's asking for money he knows you don't have. He doesn't care. He says if we don't pay him, he'll expose everything to the authorities and make sure both Jasmine and I go to prison. Maybe you should go to the authorities first. Marcus looked at me with surprise. You want me to confess to crimes? I want you to get ahead of this before it gets worse. If you cooperate with an investigation, if you help them understand how Derek is escalating from business threats to stalking, maybe they'll be willing to work with you, or maybe they'll arrest me and Jasmine and throw us both in prison. Maybe, but at least then you'd be safe from Derek. It wasn't much of a choice, but from where I sat, it looked like the only choice that didn't involve continuing to run and hide indefinitely. I need to think about it, Marcus said. Don't think too long. The longer this goes on, the worse it's going to get. Through the sliding door, I could see Jasmine pacing in my living room, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from outside, I could see the tension in her posture, the quick nervous movements that suggested whoever she was talking to wasn't delivering good news. Who's she talking to? I asked. Marcus followed my gaze and his expression darkened. Probably her lawyer. She has a lawyer. Derek's not the only person she's had problems with. Running the kind of business she's been running tends to create enemies. More enemies. More complications I hadn't been told about. I was beginning to understand that Jasmine's problems were bigger and more complex than either she or Marcus had admitted. What kind of enemies? Clients who figured out they were paying for fake engagement. Other people in the industry who didn't like the competition. A few small businesses who found out their competitors were buying followers while they were building their audiences organically. Anyone else who might be threatening her. Not threatening exactly, but there are a couple of lawsuits pending. Lawsuits, criminal activity, stalking, blackmail. The list of problems Jasmine had brought to my house kept growing longer and more serious. Marcus, I said, turning to face him directly, I need you to understand something. I've tried to be supportive because you're my son and because I believe everyone deserves help when they're in trouble. But this situation has gotten completely out of hand. I know it's complicated, it's not complicated, it's dangerous, and I'm not equipped to handle it. What are you saying? I'm saying that Jasmine needs to find somewhere else to stay. Tonight, the word tonight seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face went pale and his hands started shaking slightly. Mom, you can't. It's not safe for her out there. It's not safe for her here either, and it's not safe for me to have her here. Derek doesn't know about this address. Are you sure about that? The pause before he answered told me he wasn't sure about anything. We've been careful, not careful enough. You involved me in this without telling me what I was getting into. You lied about work, lied about why she needed to stay here, and lied about how long it would last. I took a breath. I can't trust either of you anymore. Jasmine appeared in the doorway, her phone call apparently finished. Her expression was grim, and whatever news she'd received had clearly not been good. "We have a problem," she announced. "Another one?" I asked. She looked at Marcus before answering. "Another one of those silent communications that excluded me from conversations about my own house. Derek knows where I am." The temperature on the porch seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus stood up straighter, his protective instincts kicking in. "How? I don't know, but he just called and described this house perfectly. The blue shutters, the maple trees in the backyard, even the address numbers by the front door." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized that my safe, quiet neighborhood had just become a potential crime scene. "What did he say?" "That I have until tomorrow night to wire him the money, or he's coming here to collect it himself." Tomorrow night, less than 24 hours to come up with $50,000 or face a confrontation with someone who'd already proven he was willing to use intimidation and threats to get what he wanted. "Then you definitely can't stay here," I said. "Eleanor, please." Jasmine's mask of cheerfulness had been completely replaced by raw desperation. "I have nowhere else to go." "You should have thought of that before you got involved in criminal activities. I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to be hurt because of them." She was right about that. Whatever crimes she'd committed, whatever poor choices had led to this situation, no one deserved to be stalked and threatened. But that didn't mean I was obligated to put myself at risk to protect her from consequences she'd created. "No, you don't deserve to be hurt. But I don't deserve to have my home turned into a target either." Marcus stepped between us again, his face desperate. "Mom, please, just one more night. We'll figure something out tomorrow." "Figure what out? You don't have $50,000. Derek knows where she is. The police can't help because you're all criminals. What exactly are you going to figure out?" "I don't know, but something. There has to be a solution." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to believe that every problem had a solution if you worked hard enough and were smart enough to find it. But some problems didn't have good solutions, only choices between different kinds of bad consequences. "The solution," I said, "is for both of you to turn yourselves in to the police before Derek decides to escalate beyond phone calls." "We can't do that." "Then you need to find somewhere else to do whatever you're going to do instead." Jasmine started crying then, not the manipulative tears I might have expected, but the kind of raw, exhausted sobbing that comes when someone finally accepts that they've run out of options. It was the first completely genuine emotion I'd seen from her, and despite everything, it made me want to comfort her. But comfort wasn't what this situation needed. What it needed was someone willing to make the hard choices that Marcus and Jasmine couldn't make for themselves. "I'm sorry," I said, "and I meant it, but you can't stay here tonight." Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that combined hurt and anger and disbelief in equal measures. "I can't believe you're throwing us out." "I'm not throwing you out, Marcus. You can stay. But Jasmine needs to find somewhere else to go." "I'm not leaving her." "Then I guess you're both leaving." The finality in my voice seemed to shock him. For 35 years, every conflict we'd had ended with compromise, with negotiation, with finding a way for everyone to get something they wanted. This was the first time I'd drawn a line and refused to cross it. "Mom, please, my decision is final." Through the sliding door, I could see the sun had finished setting behind Harold's maples. In a few minutes, it would be completely dark, and whatever danger Derek represented would feel more immediate and more frightening. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. Marcus and Jasmine spent the next hour making phone calls, searching for friends or relatives or anyone else who might offer them shelter for the night. I stayed in my kitchen, cleaning counters that didn't need cleaning and organizing cabinets that were already perfectly organized, listening to their increasingly desperate conversations without offering to help. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also necessary. They'd created this situation through their own choices, and they needed to find their own way out of it. Finally, around 9 o'clock, they gathered Jasmine's belongings and prepared to leave. Marcus hugged me goodbye with the kind of stiff formality that told me our relationship had fundamentally changed. "I hope you're happy," he said. "I'm not happy, Marcus. But I'm safe." After they left, I walked through my house slowly, taking inventory of what had changed during Jasmine's 4-day stay. The throw pillows on my couch were back in their original positions. The coffee table was clear of magazines I'd never bought. My bathroom towels hung neatly on their racks, dry and unused. Everything looked exactly as it had before they'd arrived, but nothing felt the same. I'd learned things about my son that I couldn't unknow, heard confessions that couldn't be taken back, drawn boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's old chair, the one Jasmine had made herself so comfortable in just a few days earlier. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, the way it had always been before strangers started threatening to show up at my door. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Found a place to stay tonight. We'll call tomorrow to talk." I didn't respond. Tomorrow's conversation, I knew, would be even more difficult than today's. But at least it would happen somewhere other than my house, between people who were free to make their own choices without dragging unwilling participants into the consequences. I finished my tea and went to bed in my own house, behind locked doors that protected only me, for the first time in a week, feeling like I could sleep safely in my own home. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound outside made me wonder if Derek had decided not to wait until tomorrow night. Every car that passed on Maple Street made me question whether I'd made the right choice in sending them away. By morning, I knew I hadn't heard the last of Marcus and Jasmine's problems. But I also knew I'd done the only thing I could do to protect myself from becoming a casualty in someone else's war. 3 days passed without a word from Marcus. I went through my morning routines, tended my garden, volunteered at the library, and tried to pretend that everything was normal. But every phone ring made my heart race, and every unexpected sound outside sent me to the windows to check if Derek had decided to pay me a visit anyway. On Thursday morning, Detective Sarah Chen knocked on my door. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with short black hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She showed me her badge and asked if she could come in to ask some questions about Marcus Patterson and Jasmine Kelly. My first instinct was to protect my son, to claim I didn't know anything about their activities. But as I looked at Detective Chen's professional expression, I realized this conversation was inevitable. Someone had finally reported the fraud operation, and the authorities were tracking down everyone involved. They were staying here until recently, I admitted, leading her to my kitchen table where so many difficult conversations seemed to happen. "When did they leave?" "Monday night. I asked them to go." Detective Chen pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Can you tell me why?" I explained everything then, from Jasmine's sudden arrival to the revelations about their criminal activities to Derek's threats. Detective Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more serious as my story unfolded. "Mrs. Patterson," she said when I finished, "you did the right thing by asking them to leave. But I need you to know that you might still be in danger." My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. From Derek, and possibly from others. "We've been investigating this operation for several months. It's bigger than your son and Miss Kelly realized." "How much bigger?" "They were small players in a network that processes millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions every year. When people in that business start cooperating with law enforcement, other people in the network get nervous." The implication was clear. If Marcus and Jasmine had been arrested, if they were talking to police, if they'd mentioned my address during questioning, then I might be seen as a potential witness or threat by people much more dangerous than Derek. "Have they been arrested?" "Miss Kelly was taken into custody yesterday morning. She's been very cooperative." "And Marcus?" Detective Chen hesitated. "We haven't been able to locate your son yet." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" "He wasn't with Miss Kelly when we found her. She says they separated Monday night after leaving your house, and she hasn't heard from him since." Marcus was missing, my son who called me twice a week and had never gone more than a few days without contact, had disappeared completely. "Where was Jasmine when you found her?" "A motel about 40 miles north of here. She'd been there since Tuesday waiting for your son to contact her, but he never showed up." "Maybe he's just scared. Maybe he's hiding until he figures out what to do." "Maybe, or maybe someone else found him first." The words hung in the air like a threat. Derek, who'd wanted $50,000 and had been willing to stalk and threaten to get it. Derek, who might have decided that if he couldn't collect from Jasmine, he'd collect from Marcus instead. We've put out a bolo for your son, Detective Chen continued. All area hospitals and morgues have been notified to contact us if anyone matching his description comes in. Morgues, the casual way she mentioned morgues made my hands shake. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you to consider staying somewhere else for a few days, until we locate your son and assess the full scope of this situation. This is my home. I understand, but your safety has to be the priority right now. I looked around my kitchen, at the table where Harold and I had shared breakfast for 23 years, at the window where I watched the sunrise every morning, at the familiar patterns of light and shadow that marked the passing of each day. The idea of abandoning all of it, because of choices my son had made, felt like letting the criminals win. I'm not leaving. Detective Chen studied my face with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she'd had this conversation before with other stubborn people in dangerous situations. Then we'll arrange for increased patrols in your neighborhood. And I'm going to give you my direct number. If anything seems unusual, if anyone contacts you about Marcus or Jasmine, if you feel threatened in any way, you call me immediately. She handed me her business card, the kind of official documentation that made this whole surreal situation feel suddenly terrifyingly real. What happens to Jasmine now? She's agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. If she provides useful information about the larger network, she might serve as little as 6 months. 6 months. It seemed like a light punishment for years of criminal activity, but I supposed cooperation had its benefits in the legal system. And if you find Marcus, that depends on how much he's willing to tell us and how deeply he was involved in the operation. Detective Chen left with a promise to call me with updates and a warning to be careful about who I trusted. After she was gone, I sat in my kitchen staring at her business card and wondering how my quiet retirement had turned into a crime drama. The phone rang an hour later. An unknown number which I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up on the 4th ring. Eleanor. The voice was Marcus, but strained and frightened in a way I'd never heard before. Marcus, where are you? The police came by looking for you. I know. I can't talk long. I just wanted you to know I'm okay. Are you okay? You sound terrible. I'm scared, Mom. Derek found me Tuesday night. He's been holding me since then, trying to get me to tell him where Jasmine stashed money that doesn't exist. Holding him, my son had been kidnapped, and I'd spent 3 days worrying about my own safety while he was being held captive by a violent criminal. Where are you? I don't know exactly. Some kind of warehouse. Mom, he's getting desperate. He keeps saying he's going to make an example of me if Jasmine doesn't pay up. She can't pay up. She's in jail. I know. That's what's got Derek so angry. He thinks this is all some kind of setup, that we planned to have her get arrested so she wouldn't have to pay him. In the background I could hear voices, men talking in the kind of aggressive tones that suggested an argument brewing. Marcus, you need to tell me where you are, so I can send help. I can't. He's got people watching, and if they think I'm cooperating with police, they'll kill me. Kill him. The word hit me like a physical blow. My son, who used to be afraid of thunderstorms and had never been in a fight in his life, was being held by people who were casually discussing murder. What can I do? Nothing. I just wanted to hear your voice in case. He stopped talking abruptly, and I could hear voices getting louder, more aggressive. Marcus, I have to go. Mom, I love you. Whatever happens, remember that I love you, and I'm sorry for dragging you into this. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone for several minutes, staring at Detective Chen's business card. Marcus had specifically said he couldn't cooperate with police because it would get him killed, but he was also in immediate danger from people who might kill him anyway. I called Detective Chen. He's being held by Derek. I told her without preamble. Some kind of warehouse. Derek's threatening to kill him if Jasmine doesn't pay money she doesn't have. Did he say anything else about the location? No, but there were other voices in the background, men arguing about something. We'll start checking warehouses in the area. Did your son say anything else? That Derek thinks Jasmine getting arrested was part of some plan to avoid paying him. We need to move fast. If Derek realizes that Miss Kelly is cooperating with us, he might decide your son is a liability rather than an asset. After Detective Chen hung up, I paced through my house, too agitated to sit still, too worried to focus on anything productive. Marcus was in immediate physical danger because of choices I'd made as much as choices he'd made. If I hadn't forced them to leave my house, if I'd been willing to shelter them for a few more days, maybe they would have found a different solution. Maybe Derek would never have found Marcus alone and vulnerable. The guilt was overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. Anger, pure focused rage at the people who'd taken my son, at the criminal enterprise that had corrupted him, at the whole dirty business that had invaded my quiet life and threatened everything I held dear. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered immediately in case it was Marcus calling from a different phone. Mrs. Patterson. The voice was unfamiliar, male with an edge that made my skin crawl. This is Derek. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. What do you want? I want what I've always wanted. $50,000, but since your boy's girlfriend is apparently unavailable, I'm adjusting the terms of our agreement. I don't have $50,000. Then you better figure out how to get it. Because if I don't have my money by midnight tonight, your son's going to start losing pieces he can't afford to lose. The threat was specific enough to make my stomach turn. This wasn't just intimidation, it was a promise of violence that Derek clearly intended to keep. I can't get that kind of money in one day. That's unfortunate for Marcus, but I'm sure a woman who owns her house outright can find creative solutions when she's properly motivated. He knew about my house, knew about my financial situation. Derek had done his research, which meant he'd been planning this conversation since before Marcus disappeared. What makes you think I'd pay money to criminals? Because the alternative is attending your son's funeral. And explaining to all your neighbors why he died for $50,000 you could have paid but chose not to. I closed my eyes, trying to think clearly through the fear and rage. Detective Chen had said they were checking warehouses, but that could take hours or days. Marcus might not have hours or days. How do I know he's still alive? Smart question. There was a pause followed by the sound of a phone being handed to someone else. Mom. Marcus's voice, weaker than before but unmistakably him. Are you hurt? Not yet, but Mom, don't give them money. Don't let them. The phone was yanked away before he could finish the sentence. Midnight, Derek said. I'll call you at 11:30 with instructions for where to bring the cash. Come alone, come unarmed, and maybe everybody goes home happy. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my kitchen with a demand I couldn't meet and a deadline I couldn't ignore. I called Detective Chen again, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried the main police number and explained the situation to a desk sergeant who assured me that Detective Chen would get the message but couldn't make any promises about timing. $50,000 by midnight. Even if I could liquidate every asset I owned, even if I could get an emergency loan against my house, there wasn't enough time to gather that kind of money through legitimate channels. But as I sat staring at Harold's old desk in the corner of the living room, I remembered something he'd told me years ago about emergency preparations. Harold had been a careful man, someone who believed in being ready for disasters both natural and financial. He'd always kept cash hidden in the house, enough to live on for several months if the banks failed or the economy collapsed. I'd never touched his emergency fund, had almost forgotten about it in the years since his death. But if it was still there, if Harold's preparations had been as thorough as everything else he'd ever done, it might be enough to save Marcus's life. I spent the next 2 hours searching through Harold's hiding places, checking behind loose floorboards and inside false bottoms of drawers, following the mental map of secret locations he'd shown me shortly before his heart attack. In the basement, inside a waterproof container hidden behind the furnace, I found $38,000 in cash. Not enough to meet Derek's demand, but close enough that it might buy time for Detective Chen to find the warehouse where Marcus was being held. At 11:15, I was sitting by my phone with the money in a canvas bag beside me, waiting for Derek's call and praying that police sirens would make the conversation unnecessary. The phone rang at exactly 11:30. "Do you have my money?" Derek asked without preamble. "I have 38,000. It's all I could get." The pause that followed seemed to last forever. "That's not what we agreed on. It's what I have. Take it or leave it." Another pause. In the background, I could hear voices again, men discussing something in urgent, angry tones. "Bring what you have to the old Riverside Industrial Park on Highway 9, Building C, loading dock entrance. You have 30 minutes. Is Marcus?" But Derek had already hung up. I drove to the industrial park with Harold's money on the seat beside me and Detective Chen's card clutched in my free hand. The park was a collection of abandoned warehouses that had been empty since the factory closures 10 years earlier, exactly the kind of isolated location where people could conduct business they didn't want witnessed. Building C was dark except for a single light over the loading dock entrance. I parked where Derek's voice from the shadows had instructed and waited with my hands visible and my heart pounding. 2 men emerged from the building, neither of whom was Derek or Marcus. They approached my car with the casual confidence of people accustomed to intimidating others. "Get out," one of them ordered. "Bring the bag." I followed their instructions, walking toward the loading dock on legs that felt unsteady. Inside the building, Derek was waiting with Marcus tied to a chair beside him. My son looked exhausted and frightened, but alive and apparently uninjured. 38,000, Derek said, weighing the canvas bag in his hands without bothering to count the contents. "I'm disappointed, Mrs. Patterson. It's all I have." "I believe you, which means your son is worth $12,000 less than I originally thought." Derek nodded to one of his men, who stepped toward Marcus with something that gleamed in the dim light. "A knife." "Wait," I said quickly. "I can get the rest." "When?" "Give me 2 more days." Derek studied my face with the kind of calculating assessment that suggested he was trying to decide whether I was lying or just desperate. "One day," he said finally. "Tomorrow night, same time, same place. $12,000, or your son loses something he can't grow back." He signaled to his men, who untied Marcus and pushed him toward me. My son stumbled, but managed to stay upright, relief flooding his face as he realized he was being released. "Mom," he said, reaching for me with shaking hands. "Tomorrow night," Derek repeated. "Don't disappoint me again." We drove home in silence, both of us too emotionally exhausted to process what had just happened. At my house, Marcus collapsed onto my couch with the kind of complete physical and emotional collapse that suggested he'd been running on adrenaline for days. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Just bruises." "They didn't really hurt me, just scared me." He looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had a week ago. "Mom, you shouldn't have paid them anything. I wasn't going to let them kill you. Now they know you'll pay. They're never going to stop asking for more." He was right, of course. Giving in to Derek's demands had saved Marcus's life temporarily, but it had also established a precedent that would be difficult to break. "We'll figure something out," I said, though I had no idea what. "We have to call Detective Chen. We have to end this." I looked at my son, this man who'd made terrible choices but was still the child I'd raised, and realized that some stories don't have happy endings. Sometimes they just have endings that allow people to survive long enough to make better choices. "Yes," I said, "we do." The next morning, Detective Chen sat in my kitchen, listening to Marcus confess everything he knew about the fraud operation, Derek's network, and the locations where he'd been held captive. It took 4 hours and filled 2 notebooks, but by the end of it Marcus had provided enough information to dismantle the entire criminal enterprise he'd helped create. Derek and his associates were arrested that afternoon at the warehouse where they'd planned to collect the remaining $12,000. Instead of my money, they found a SWAT team waiting for them. Marcus spent 6 months in minimum security prison, during which time he completed his GED in computer programming and started rebuilding the legitimate career he'd abandoned. Jasmine served 4 months and moved to another state after her release, sending me a brief note of apology that felt more obligatory than sincere. I kept Harold's emergency fund in the basement, replacing the $38,000 I'd used to buy Marcus's life with money from the reward the FBI paid for information leading to arrests in their fraud investigation. Some preparations, I learned, were even more valuable than the person who made them could have imagined. My house is quiet again, the way it was before Marcus brought his problems to my door. But the silence feels different now, earned rather than simply inherited. I'd protected my home and saved my son's life, proving that even at 71, I was still capable of fighting for what mattered most. Some stories end with lessons learned and relationships repaired. This one ended with survival and second chances, which turned out to be enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.